Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me here, Remote Design Week. I'm really excited to be here and to present for you Deconstructing the User Interface. I have to do this little fun intro that I always get to do for these things just to get kind of things started off on a nice, fun moment. Here we go.
This is Bob Baxley broadcasting live from the studios of KDUX, located in beautiful Los Altos, California, in the heart of Silicon Valley.
So, wherever you are, I hope you're having a great day. And away we go. Here we are. So, let me just start with kind of an informal survey. I'm curious, how many of you had trouble using some piece of software in the past month, week, day? Come on, raise your hand. Come on, I know it's everybody. It's got to be everybody. If I could see you, I would know it's everybody. I'm sure all of you have had something in the past month. When I do this live, when we're all together, I then say, okay, how many even the past week? Most of the hands stay up. And I'm like, okay, how many today? And actually, it's always a little shocking and a little disappointing that quite a few hands stay up, even when I ask, who's had some frustrating experience with software already today? And I make this point because the truth is, software is kind of broken. We all know this feeling. We all know this experience. We all know that our users are on the other end of this experience a lot more times than we would like. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves about the state of the world of software and software design. This is a great quote. For a list of all the ways technology has failed to improve the quality of life, please press 3. We know this feeling like, I don't know, there's times when you're kind of wondering if all this technology has been a net positive or not for our lives. And I faced that question pretty intensely a few years back. I had left Pinterest in about 2016 and had a little time to reflect on what at that point was about a 25-year career in tech. And 2016 was a complicated moment in time. I was a little unclear how I felt about technology. It felt like, particularly in Silicon Valley, technology had been overtaken by the paid advertising business. And that was not a business model that I was terribly excited about. And it just made me really question what I had done as a software designer, the meaning of it all, and kind of what the profession had really meant. But I'd come to Silicon Valley and I'd fallen in love with the place quite some time ago in 1990 because there was sort of this interesting hippie vibe that ran through Silicon Valley. And I felt that that hippie vibe was still there somewhere. And fortunately, I stumbled across this podcast, which I recommend. It's a podcast called Raw Data that's published by a group at Stanford. And I believe it was in season 2. They talk kind of about the history of Silicon Valley, and they start with the founding of Stanford University, and they end up with Mark Zuckerberg testifying in front of Congress. And in the context of that podcast, they pose this really interesting question about, how did the philosophical attitudes in Northern California and Silicon Valley lead to the development and concept of personal computing? And I came across this quote that they referenced in the podcast from this amazing book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture, written by Fred Turner. And this really kind of traces the hippie roots of Silicon Valley to the birth of personal computing. And one of the quotes here is, what separated the isolated experiments with small computers from the full-blown birth of personal computing was the West Coast realization that computing was a new medium, like books, records, movies, radio, and television. And what he's referencing here is at the time when personal computing really got started, which was in the late 60s, early 70s, most all tech companies in the United States were based on the East Coast. So why was it that personal computing got started here? And it was this realization again that computing was a new sort of medium. And that idea that it was a medium, and that it was kind of a peer, to books, to music, and to movies sort of brought back to me what I loved about working in software. And it helped me realize that I did love this medium and that I was really kind of a creature of this medium. And I wanted to continue to put my life energy and my creative energy into working in this medium. And it got me thinking particularly about movies, because it turns out I went to film school, never pursued a career in film, but like I studied film and I thought a lot about movies and how they're put together. An interesting thing about movies is when you go watch a movie, you see the whole movie. You don't think about all the constituent parts of the movie. You experience the whole thing all at once, as you tend to do with software. But if you start talking to your friends after you've seen a movie, all of us, even though few of us go to film school and none of us are really professional critics. All of us have a way of deconstructing a movie and talking about the various elements and how a movie is put together and how all these things do and don't work together. Any one of us could have a really intelligent call about or conversation about the plot of a movie, the characters of a movie, the set decoration, the editing, the lighting, the cinematography. There's all these different elements of a movie that we could talk about, but we don't really have that same sort of shared vocabulary for user interface. And I do think that software is at least as complex a medium as movies, particularly if you include video games in software. Then there is absolutely no doubt that software is indeed more visually, or sorry, more rich as a communication medium and more complex than anything else human beings have ever created. The problem is that most of us see software as a single monolithic and complete thing. We don't really have this kind of parallel framework. We don't really have a vocabulary for deconstructing the experience or critiquing individual elements. We can't really see the trees because all we can see is the forest. I've done this exercise with design candidates and with people on my team all the time. You ask them what their favorite apps are. Generally, people look at their home screen and they talk about apps that they use a lot, but those aren't necessarily a favorite apps. And they can't even really typically they can't even tell you why they like them. Maybe they like the content, maybe they like the functionality, but when you really ask them about the UI, what is it about the user interface, the user experience that you like so much? Very, very few people have a good answer to that question. And I wonder how many of you actually have a good answer to that question. Hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll at least have a different way of thinking about that question. Public critiques and reviews of software invariably focus on the functionality, ignoring any aspect of the UI beyond the aesthetics of the visual design. Most people are like, oh, it looks cool, but they're not really thinking more deeply about it. And then, of course, have you ever read a product review that made mention of things like the conceptual model, the information architecture, or even the overall usability of the product? Maybe that last one you'll hear a little bit, product's confusing or something, but like I've never heard, Kara Swisher or Walter Mossberg or Dave Pogue, like nobody has ever talked about the information architecture or the conceptual model in the same way that you would see a movie critic talk about, a genre breaking film, or the script was really interesting. You never see software or technology critics talk about software in the same way that other cultural critics talk about the medium that they're analyzing. So the question for us today, what I hope to cover the next 20 some odd minutes, is how can we deconstruct a UI so we can talk about what's good and bad, referring to the whole thing, and without our critique being random or indifferent to how it all fits together. Now, most of us are kind of familiar with this level of deconstruction. We can have the structure of a product, we have the wireframes, and we have the visual design that often takes the form of things like this. You see these big old giant whiteboards with an information architecture of a product or a website, wireframes where we're sort of breaking down individual pages and we're looking at boxes and arrows and copy blocks. And of course, visual design, this is the most obvious and visible piece. It's really just graphic design for software. Certainly incredibly important, but maybe not the only important thing, but it tends to be the most visible thing and the element of the UI that we tend to talk about the most. What does it look like? As though what it looks like is a thing. So that's a reasonable framework to start with, but it's not really good enough. It's not granular enough for productive or structured critique of the work because there's just too many other things going on inside each layers. And in addition, even though a lot of practitioners kind of intuitively work in that sequence, very few people that I've seen or worked with or talked to ever pause to really consider the implications of the decisions in each of those layers and how everything kind of relates back and how they intertwine. It's more they build just very directly one on top of the other. And I'm sure many of you have known, you'll get into visual design of blowing up frames because it didn't really work. You haven't really thought about how the wireframes related to the conceptual model, the information architecture. Like people, it's very hard to kind of understand how all those pieces fit together, even though we try to make it seem like it's this really structured, linear way of working. It's really not. Everything kind of has to balance together. So I want to go back to movies a little bit. As I mentioned, I went to film school, so it's kind of a thing for me to talk about. And I want us to take a moment and kind of think about how you might deconstruct a movie. I mentioned a few elements before, but if we go back and we look at this, like a movie is kind of composed of the story of the movie, If we're looking at the chart here, the story, the production of the movie, and then the final presentation. And even inside the story, we can start to break things down. There's the genre of the movie, the characters, the plot. The production's composed of, the cinematography, the production design, the acting, the presentation, what we might call post-production and film language, effects, editing, score, and all of these things. For one, we could all talk about them, and we would all have references to different movies that we thought were particularly good in these layers. And what's interesting is when you look at like genre, some of the most interesting movies, successful movies, are one that kind of twist the genre. For example, I think of Star Wars as sort of a cowboy western set in space. So the genre of a cowboy western, but then they put it into a different setting, and that everything that happened after that. And score, editing, effects. We've all seen movies where they had amazing music or amazing special effects, but the story still sucks. And if the story sucks, the whole thing kind of falls apart. At the same time, you can have a great story, and if the editing and the effects and the music suck, like the whole thing kind of falls apart as well. So all these things have to interrelate, and they have to build on top of each other. Again, with sort of the supporting layers in presentation and production, those supporting layers working in concert with these more foundational layers of the genre, the characters, the plot, all the things that come from the script. And I think this quote from Walt Disney kind of sums it up. If the story is good, the picture may be good, but the story is weak, color, music, and animation cannot save it. So maybe the big point here is like all these things have to work in concert. They all have to be supporting one another. But even with that, we can think about them and discuss them kind of individually. So we need a framework for deconstructing the interrelationships between the various aspects of a interface, because it's as valuable to what we do as it is to how movie making works. And such a framework provides a sort of UI grammar that allows us to purposely and consistently analyze and discuss the mechanics of the underlying UI. I don't remember how many of you had to diagram sentences, and if you did, I'm sorry, I had to do it, and it's sort of a mess. I don't remember it fondly, but it's kind of useful. And you can see this is a kind of an interesting thing of different opening sentences from famous novels. You can see Moby Dick there on the left-hand page towards the top. There's a great one from Anna Karenina too on the other side. Happy families are alike. Even every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And we know when we're learning to write that this sort of structure is useful for understanding what makes a sentence work and not work. So if we were to create that same sort of model, that same sort of structure for UI, what would it look like? How would we do that? Well, not surprising, I'm going to kind of go back to before here, and I'm going to transition from the movie analogy back to UI. So instead of having the plot and the story, we're going to have structure. And the structure starts with the conceptual model, and we have the task flow, the organizational model. I'm going to go through all 9 of these layers in a second. So I just want to kind of set up the high level structure, and then we'll come back to these things. So the structured tier is composed of the 3 most fundamental and abstract aspects of the UI. Nobody ever touches these areas. They can't really think about these things. A user will never really describe these things in a very conscious way. But paradoxically, they're the most important aspects of the product. I mean, this is the thing that's going to determine how everything else functions together and whether or not the product is usable. If a user doesn't understand the conceptual model from the very beginning, like nothing else you can do is ever going to fix it. They're going to be completely confused the entire time. If you don't fundamentally understand that Microsoft Word is a typewriter for writing words, if you think it's something else, you're never going to be able to understand how to use that product. Next up is the behavior layer, viewing and navigation behaviors, editing and manipulation behaviors, and what I call user assistance. These describe all the interactive qualities as opposed to the conceptual framework, and it calls on the designer to anticipate and accommodate the user's actions as well as the system's reaction as they unfold over time. It's really when you get into these behavioral things, like how does somebody edit data? How do they change the view of the data? How do we report errors back to them? This is when you really start talking to the technology, and what the engineering can do informs a lot of what you have to design for here, as opposed to the structural level where it is pretty abstract and sort of lives more in the designer's head. There's a lot more flexibility in the structural levels than there are in the behavioral levels. And the last up's the presentation tier, where we get really a little bit more into the really super visible parts of the UI, the things that people can relate to the most and talk about the most, the layout, the style, sort of the visual style, typography, colors, things like that. And then finally the written text that appears in the UI. Um, the interesting thing about the presentation layer is that unlike traditional graphic design, it has to simultaneously accommodate pixel level detail and system-wide standards. So when you're designing software and you're thinking about this presentation layer, you have to think about how it plays out over the entire software product, which has given rise a lot to this notion of design standards and why we need guidebooks for using all that stuff. And strangely, this is the thing that people think about the most when they think about design. When you show somebody a piece of software and you ask them what they think about the design, it's these layers. It's usually kind of more than anything, it's like the colors and the typography and the illustrations they're going to talk about the most, even though that's just one component of a whole lot of other things that all have to work together. So let me kind of break this down and go through each one of those and give you some examples so it's a little bit more clear the different areas I'm talking about. And I want to start with the structure layers. I've got a quote to kind of introduce each one of these bigger groupings. So again, structure is sort of what's the framework for the software. And I love this quote from Edward Tufte, who many of you probably know: "Design is clear thinking made visible." So if we start with the conceptual model, it's the most fundamental aspect of the UI, and it relates the UI to the known world. It allows the users to associate something new with something known. It helps them to quickly and accurately make predictions about the behavior and capabilities. It answers the basic question of what is this thing? So go back to my earlier point. If you don't understand that Microsoft Word is a tool for writing documents, you're going to be confused from the get-go. If you don't understand that Google Slides is a kind of page by page, one slide at a time type presentation tool, you're going to be confused. If you don't understand that Facebook is a feed, that Twitter is a feed, if you don't understand the concept of a feed, you're going to be confused from the very get-go. The interesting thing about the conceptual model too, though, is it's a place again where you can take the user in unexpected and carry them along if you're still true to a conceptual model they know. My Star Wars example, I'll pull out again. Star Wars is a cowboy movie set in space. Right? They took something you knew, which is a cowboy movie, and they put it into a different setting, outer space, and it created something an entirely different movie experience, and obviously a incredibly memorable story. One analogy I've found in software is this product Habitica, which I just love as a really interesting example of twisting the conceptual model. So Habitica is essentially it's a habit tracker, to-do list manager, but instead of gamifying a to-do list manager and adding rewards, to something that was fundamentally managing to-do list, Habitica flips that around, and Habitica is fundamentally a game. It is fundamentally about adopting and advancing a character, and in order to earn points into your character along through the game, you have to do things on your to-do list, and you have to keep up with your habits. Join with other people, and you can go on these quests together, which is an interesting way of creating accountability partners. Because if you're all trying to kill the dragon together, and somebody's not getting their stuff done, you can hold them accountable for holding the team back. So these are a few of the screens. You can see starting on the left there, the habits, and then to-dos, what they call your daily things. So these are like some of the daily stuff you want to do. And then as you do these the day, you actually earn points. There on my far right, I'm Bob the Procrastinate. I was a level 102 healer. You can see where I am on the rewards. You can see my health, my experience. And by doing various things, I collected points so I could buy different pieces of gear. Now, I don't still use this tool, but as a UI designer, I just thought this was a fascinating example, a completely different way to think about to-do list managers. So it's a big shift in the conceptual model of this whole class of products. So that's the conceptual model. We'll move on and talk about the task flow. The task flow is the manner in which users complete specific operations. It's dependent on the product's hardware and software interface. Like the way that you are able to accomplish things on a mobile app is different from how you would do things on a kiosk, is different from how you would do things on a desktop computer, is different from how you do things on a TV. I've just taken one example here. This is a bicycling clothing site called Rafa. And this is just a really straightforward checkout flow, but you'll see as you go from left to right that they've implemented this as a wizard. And this is like a conscious choice they had to make. They decided that, oh, these steps are going to flow linearly, step 1, step 2, step 3. Now they could have made a choice differently. They could have done it as an accordion, so it was all one long page, and they section by section. By contrast, a different structural model might be something like this, a hub, where you have a single page that shows you kind of launching points, and you kind of go off one by one. In the case of Apple settings, you can, you see the menu of things you can do. You go from, if you click on Bluetooth, you go off to your Bluetooth form, and then you come back to this page. Same thing with these two other settings pages. It's a very common structural flow. Again, there's only a few of these structural flows that users would be familiar with, some of the vocabulary here, but it's still a conscious part of the experience, a conscious part of the UI that we need to be able to have a conversation about. Should be a wizard? Should it be a hub? Should it be what I call a guide? Like, how should we structure these flows? And how often do we actually have those really conscious decisions and conscious discussions about, which one of these options is the best? What are the relative pros and cons? Next up is the organizational model. This is also known as the information architecture. How am I putting together both the content and the functionality? Like, what's the menu structure for this? Like, what are the main objects that are going to show up when a user first comes to the product? And for this, I like to talk about zoos, because I think zoos are a really interesting example of information architecture and the power of information architecture. This is a map of the San Francisco Zoo, and I just want to point out that the San Francisco Zoo, like many American zoos, was built over a long period of time when the way in which they wanted to represent nature was shifting. And so there's actually multiple models here for how you would organize animals from nature. You'll see the South American area, right? Well, okay, well, what is South America really, and why is it only an anteater? What does it mean to organize animals by continent? And then next to South America, what you see is bear country. So here, what they're actually doing is they're organizing the animals by taxonomy. We're gonna gather all the bears together, no matter where they come from. And although they don't have it on the map, I think they actually have a polar bear in here as well. So, next to this area called South America, they have a polar bear next to a black bear near a grizzly bear. Like, that is a certain model that nature is sort of like postage stamps, and we're just going to collect things taxonomically because things are somehow related. You'll see the same thing down there below with the cat kingdom. They also have like a pachyderm cage, which is where the rhinos and the elephants used to be. Even all the monkeys and apes are gathered together as though that's how nature is organized. Nature's not really organized in this taxonomic way. The only place here in the zoo, the two places where it's really closer to how nature is organized, is the Africa region in the bottom left, and then the Outback Trail in the upper right. We're finally, and these are the more modern parts of the zoo, they've organized the zoo around actual ecosystems in nature, and they're trying to display, no, nature's actually a complete whole. These animals interrelate. Here's what the landscape where they live. They've evolved and grown to work and live in this particular type of area. And again, like, this has really important political and political implications and real meaning about how people perceive nature. Is it something that we can break up and fragment and just grab these different species wherever they are in the world? Or should we be thinking about nature as these holistic areas that need to be kept together because they work as a complete system? If we take that back to software, this is another example. With mobile applications in particular, I think the information architecture is most clearly demonstrated in the tray in the mobile app. And if you ever just look at the objects in a tray, I always ask, can a user tell what the app is about and really quickly understand the whole app just by looking at the objects in the tray? And I'm guessing with many of these, you probably can. Obviously the one on the left, it has to do with planes. The next one over has to do with trains, booking trains. So those are pretty obvious. The next one's a little bit unclear what that's about. And then the final one has a famous logo in the middle, so you can probably spot that a little bit easier. But if you don't know the logo, it's a little unclear with the one on the far right. Like, what is that really about? Because, like, is inbox and saved really equal to trips and explore? Like, what's really going on here? If we expose the rest of the apps, obviously the first one, United, second one, Amtrak, Disneyland, again, sort of the tray, the information architecture of the Disneyland app doesn't really do a great job of telling you what the app is about and what you can do in the app. And I'd argue, at least at this stage, I think the Airbnb app might have evolved since then. I'm not sure that the Airbnb app really does a great job of communicating to you in the tray what are the types of things that you can do with the app. So it's just an example of how information architecture has an enormous impact on usability and a user's understanding of the product, and is probably one of your biggest leverage points for helping users understand the universe of things that they can do, the types of objects that they can manipulate in the product. Okay, we're moving up to the behavior layers. Design is not just what it looks like. Design is how it works. We talk about the viewing and navigation behaviors. This encompasses the wide variety of behaviors that operate in operations, allow the user to navigate the interface and affect its presentation. This is all this sort of stuff like resizing windows, customizing a palette, sorting data, etc. I just picked these examples. These are all different examples of how to filter a found set in an e-commerce site. And you can just see that Amazon, Apple, and I believe, again, this is Airbnb or maybe VRBO there at the end. Just different ways of approaching this same problem. This is a particular aspect of the UI, allowing you to change the view. Move along here to editing and manipulation. Editing and manipulation is where you get into forms. There's a difference here because in the viewing and navigation behaviors, the user can't really generate any errors, and they're not ever writing shared data back to the. They're not writing actual data back to the server, so they can manipulate freely the view of things in the same way you can move things around on the desktop on your phone, and there's not, or the desktop on your computer. You're not really generating errors. There's not really anything being sent back to the server in a meaningful way. Here, when you're in these editing behaviors, you're actually changing data, and there's all sorts of implications with helping to make sure the user understands what those changes are going to be, how they're going to what implications they have for the behavior of the app. There's errors that can be generated, etc. Next up is user assistance. This is all the elements of the UI that informs the user about the application's activity. It's also all the stuff that is related to the user education, telling them about the product and how to use it. Includes a whole bunch of stuff like FAQs, error alerts, notifications, spinners, feature tutorials, and status alerts. Just some examples here. I find casual gaming to be one of the most interesting ways, or some of the most innovative places to look for product introduction stuff, like here from Cut the Rope, how they teach you how to use the app by actually using the game. They teach you a lot. They do this in Angry Birds as well. The way that they've got these little tour parts, slide your finger, deliver candy. This is much more interesting than sort of the standard tour stuff that just pops up as an overlay and tries to point something out. This actually is letting you test the app, and it's teaching you how to use the app by actually having you use the app. So very interesting way of introducing the app's functionality. Product tours. It's an example from Airtable. Sorry. And then here, this is some interesting error alert handling. This is also part of user assistance and kind of has to be considered usually in the context of forms. You see LinkedIn here, some more stuff from Rafa. You see how they're handling the valid email stuff. And then this is kind of an interesting one over on the far right. This is from the Wallet app for United Airlines. They have a really interesting mechanism for circling the gate and sort of drawing your attention, again, sort of this bit of user assistance drawing you into that particular interesting element on the screen. Then we're going to kind of cut along to the presentation layer here. Nothing worse than a brilliant image of a fuzzy concept. One of my favorite quotes, especially when it comes from Ansel Adams, the photographer. Talk a little bit about the layout. This is typically what people are dealing with when they talk about wireframes, the placement of the ordering of the on-screen elements. Hopefully it provides like an ordered visual flow, and it supports the other layers by positioning elements in a manner that conveys relationships, importance, and usage. I've just pulled a few examples here. These are all travel sites. It's interesting when you start looking across, kind of genres of apps, is they all kind of have a standard layout. And this is an example of how the layout itself helps to speak to, all the way down to the conceptual model of what is this thing about? Oh, this is a travel app. And you can tell that almost if you just squint your eyes and look at the stuff. And if you didn't even see the text, you could probably tell that this is some sort of travel app just because of the way they've laid the screens out and the way that they're treating the imagery. Somewhere there's a bunch of content sites. These are all news sites. Similarly, these all kind of look the same. The layouts are very similar. I mean, news sites have a certain way of communicating. And then probably no better example than all the streaming and video sites, which all have a very similar look and feel. They've, especially if you use them on TV apps, there's really less and less difference between the major streaming apps in terms of the UI. It's really the content that's just shifting, and that tells you that the presentation now has gotten so directly connected to the conceptual model, and all this stuff has just kind of gotten stabilized, which from a usability perspective is awesome because it means that the user can kind of seamlessly go between these different applications without having to learn anything new. We're going to kick up to the style level. This incorporates both the graphic design and animation. The interesting thing about style is it has to simultaneously communicate emotion and tone, which is sort of the world of traditional graphic design, but you also have to communicate affordance and structure, which is not something, affordance in particular is not something traditional graphic design has to worry with. This is the most visible and concrete aspect of the UI, and it accounts for the audience's first and most conscious impression. This is the thing people are going to talk about the most when they talk about your UI. I'm going to try. I don't get to quote myself too often, but I'm going to do that here. This is from a book I wrote many, many years ago. Like all forms of design, visual design is about problem solving. It's not about personal preference or unsupported opinion. I always stop people in design reviews when they're like, "Oh, well, it's just kind of this seems like a subjective thing. It's just a matter of opinion." I always sort of back up and say, "No, if you think that, it's because we haven't defined the problem clearly enough. What are we actually trying to communicate?" And if we can define exactly what we're trying to communicate, then we can come to a shared understanding of, is this graphic design, is this visual presentation communicating that or not? One of the examples I like to use here is Headspace on the left two screenshots, and Waking Up, which is another meditation app on the right. I mean, these two apps are essentially the same functionality. They're content-based meditation apps, but they communicate a very different feeling based on the graphic design, obviously. Headspace is a great app, but many of the people I know who've used it, including myself, like, use it for about a year and then you move on. And I think part of it is that it feels kind of like you outgrow it in some ways. And this playful animation style, while initially really attractive, I'm not sure that it ages particularly well the longer you use the app. I feel like often you kind of end up wanting something more, maybe more serious is the wrong way to put it, but sometimes it feels like that. And when I look at Headspace, as much as I like and admire the app, I do sort of wonder if that was a really conscious choice. Like, did they have some meeting where they decided, well, we want to make the app really approachable, and we want to make it unintimidating. So we're going to go with this kind of fun animation style, or was it something that got proposed by a designer, maybe for those animations, and then everybody said, "Hey, that looks kind of cool. Let's go with that." And then there's sort of in that, and it's hard to get out of. You compare that to Waking Up, which is clearly kind of a much more serious thing. You can just tell from the photography and even the titles of some of these things that it's just a very different feeling. Even though these two apps do very different thing or do the same thing, it's a very different graphic design style, which makes you think really differently about the two apps. And finally, the last level, sort of the text. This is the UX copy. It's often overlooked. It contains all the text-based elements, and it includes the control and form labels, names of input and navigational controls, as well as all messages and alerts. Here's a bunch of different error messages. I always try to push the team on error messages. Like, this is a place where the user's already really frustrated, so it seems like the place that we should try to be the nicest to them. United Airlines seems to be sort of apologetic here. They apologize twice just right up there at the beginning, but apparently they're not so concerned that they figured out how to do the text wrapping on the mobile app. So that's sort of a bummer. They apologize, but it seems only somewhat sincere. The New York Times, they're also a little apologetic. We're sorry. We seem to have lost this page. Like, they seem like they've lost it, but we don't want you to lose it. Adobe's kind of funny here with this uncharted waters. Sorry that the page can't be found. Again, a little bit apologetic, which is nice. Google's just like pretty techie, like boom, bam, in your face. 404. Okay, that's an error. Requested URL is not found. That's all we know. I don't know. They don't seem to be taking a lot of responsibility here, whereas some of the other sites do. And again, the difference here is the same error. It's just a very different tone in the copy and how the text is written. This is an example from Bonobos that I pulled out because I think it illustrates how much the copy can have an impact on the feeling of the app. This starting on the left, outfitting made easy. You never have to worry about what to wear. the way that they talk about notifications. I love some of this stuff in that third screen will notify you, but only about things you care about. Maybe not the best constructed sentence, but still they're trying to let you know that they're not going to spam you. And then from the home screen there over on the far right, the notification, you left something in the cart and it's rolling away. Oh no, it's going into traffic. Quick, save it. They're trying to be funny, which is a nice tone and I think fits their brand. So again, kind of thinking hard about your copy. Probably not something you should have your designers writing. If you don't have copywriter on your team, you should definitely get one. And something you should be really conscious about when you're designing the UI, like how are you going to communicate with text? It's just as important as typography, color, everything else. So what's all this mean? Well, here's the model again. And the big implication here is really in these three axes at the bottom. So let me walk you through those. If you think about user awareness, like which parts of the UI are they thinking the most about? Strangely enough, it's things like text. Like I don't understand what it's saying. I don't like the color of it. I can't quite tell where things are located. That's all these presentation layers. That's the stuff that they're going to be far and away the most aware of. You'll never hear a user consciously talk about how the task flow is set up, what the conceptual model is. They won't even necessarily break apart all these behavioral things. They'll mostly talk about what it looks like. But strangely, it's these lower level things, again, the conceptual model, task flow, these elements that have the biggest impact on usability. In addition, like the things that the users pay the most attention to are the things that are the easiest to manipulate. Like you can actually change the text really easily. You can change the style really easily. This is a lot of the stuff that gets tested in A/B testing to try to increase usage of these features. But the things down at the bottom, the concept model, task flow, organizational model, like once those things get decided, they are very, very difficult to change. Like once you decide that Word is basically an electronic typewriter, like that gets embedded in the code in a really, really deep way. You will never break away from that. And I pointed out again, because I just haven't sat through that many design reviews where we had really intense, lengthy, detailed discussions about these lower level critical elements of the UI. More often than not, people tend to have an instinct right from the beginning and they just go with it instead of backing up and trying to come up with variations and to think more deeply about how these parts of the UI could be different right from the very beginning. So again, layers which users are most aware of and easiest to change have the lowest impact on overall usability. The layers progress from foundational supporting, but most design effort is spent on supporting layers, with foundation layers being accepted as givens. And then once the foundation layers have been expressed in code, they're fixed for the life of the product. You just can't change them. Now, I've structured this and shown you this diagram as though it's this like really strict hierarchy and you do one thing after the next thing after the next thing. Of course, it doesn't really work that way. Of course, a UI, like a movie, is actually this incredibly complex, elegant, balanced mobile with all these different pieces supporting and interacting with one another. And we have to think about it that way too. But even so, we need some vocabulary and some method of being able to break down these individual elements, talk about them, dissect them, analyze them, critique them, be able to pull out good examples from different apps. You don't have to like the whole app. Maybe you just like one particular piece of it, but you need to be articulate about what that is and be able to describe it to others. And I think that this is critical to how we get away from these sorts of moments. Like we just need to get better at not only designing software, but critiquing it and talking about it, again, sort of as a cultural artifact. We need our users to get more sophisticated in talking about software and getting better at increasing their demands and their expectations. And of course, we need to expect more of ourselves and our colleagues. Because to me, software is one of the modern miracles. It is one of the things we get to experience that our ancestors didn't. It's as magical as air travel. It is, to me, like one of the most magical things in the world. And I don't want software to feel like this. I want software to feel like this. I want to get on a computer or to get on my mobile phone and feel like it is truly a bicycle for my mind, and that I am using this amazing tool and participating in this cultural artifact that is somehow making my life richer and more meaningful, and truly helping me to be a more fulfilled person. So I hope all of you like pause at different points during your career and realize just how much software matters. That you are working in the most important cultural medium that there is today, and that you feel kind of lucky and blessed to have that opportunity. and that you do what you can kind of day in and day out to make the best software you can, never forgetting that there's an audience out there that's using it, and that you have the opportunity to make that audience's life a little bit better with your work. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this was useful. I think we're going to do a little Q&A now. I'm always open to answering emails. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter. And this is my personal email address. So I hope to hear from some of you. Thank you very much for paying attention.